This video is going to be on testing the TPS sensor, so the throttle position sensor, and we're going to do it with three different tools. We're going to use a DVOM, fluke meter, then we're going to use a scan tool, and then we're going to use a scope, and we're going to look at it in all three scenarios. And the reason I want you to do this is so that if you don't have access to one of these three tools, you should have access to at least to a DVOM, and you should be able to test all the sensors with that. I'm also going to show you a couple of hacks to make this go a little bit faster in the lab so you don't have to spend so much time doing it. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first things first, we're going to look at the hookups. So I've got my meter leads hooked into the volts and the ground on my DVOM, and I'm going to set this to voltage here in a minute. So I've got my throttle position sensor located right here. I've got it back probed, and I've got my positive lead on my meter hooked into the T-pin on the back probe, and then I've got my negative meter lead hooked on to the battery over here. So if we come back here to the vehicle, or sorry, to the fluke meter, if you notice, these meter leads that I'm using are yellow. They're not the typical red meter leads that you would normally find on a fluke meter. And the reason I'm doing that is because I grabbed the meter leads out of one of the Modus scan tools. And the reason I did that is so that I can leave everything hooked up to the engine and I can switch between this and my picoscope. And I'll show you how that's done when we get to the picoscope part of it. So I'm going to check the throttle position sensor. I've got my key on, engine off. I'm going to turn this to volts DC, and I should have half a volt, which I do. I got 5.57 volts. Then as I run the throttle position sensor up, I should see a gradual increase of voltage all the way up until I get to wide open throttle. There's wide open throttle, and then let it down all the way down. I like to do this slow. Just what I'm looking for is I'm looking for any jumps in the voltage. So as long as it progressively goes up and then progressively comes down nice and even and smooth, I'm good. Now I'm going to do a couple of snap throttle tests. So you should see it jump all the way up to 4.4 volts or 4.5 volts and then back down to a half a volt. One thing you can do with your fluke meter is hit the min-max button. Now when I do the snap throttle test, it's going to capture the minimum and the maximum. So I've done that. You heard it beep going up. Every time it beeps, it's capturing a new signal. So now I hit the min-max button once. That's my maximum. And I hit the min-max button again. That's my minimum. So that way I can tell whether or not the TPS was where it was supposed to be at the minimum and where it was at the maximum. Oh, that's the average, sorry. So let's do that again. So roll it up, and then I hit maximum, so that's 4.4 volts. There's my minimum was 0.56, and my average was 0.76. So that's one way to test with the DVOM. Another way that I like to test with the DVOM on the throttle position sensor is there's a bar graph that comes across the bottom here. Now in order to get that bar graph, what we have to do is we have to get out of the min-max, and in order to do that you just hit the off button and then bring it back to 12 volts DC. And I'm going to hit my range. So I hit my range button until you see that little bar graph that showed up right there. Now watch that while I run the throttle position up and down. See how that goes across? Gives me a little bar graph, and so that way I can easily see if there's a glitch in the TPS. So if it jumps around while it's going up and down, that's not good. So anyway, that's using the fluke meter. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to look at the scan tool. The scan tool I'm using on this is the Virus, and so I've already got the vehicle plugged in, so I'm going to go to Engine, and I'm going to go to Data Display, and I'm going to go to Engine Data. And then I'm going to look down here and I'm going to find the TPS, which is right here. I can hit that button right there and you look at that, it graphs it, and it also gives me a number up here. You can use this graph in place of using the oscilloscope if you're comfortable with using the oscilloscope. If you're not comfortable with using the oscilloscope, I'd like you to use it enough that you get comfortable with it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same test. I'm going to run the TPS up and run it back down. And if you see, it's graphing it right here in the yellow. So I'll run it up a little bit slower this time. So you can kind of see it going up. There's my peak. And now we'll come back down. And what you're doing is you're looking for a nice even slope up, slope down, and you should be going from 0.5 volt to 0.5 volts. And that's how you test it with the scan tool. So, piece of cake. Now, remember that hack I was talking about? I'm using these meter leads, or these scope leads out of the scan tool, and you can use any scope leads or meter leads as long as they plug in like this, okay? So without disconnecting from the vehicle at all, what I'm going to do is just disconnect them from the scan or the fluke meter. So once I've got them disconnected from the fluke meter, these are my meter leads that are coming off from the oscilloscope. These are the meter leads off from the fluke meter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take black and black, and I'm just going to plug that into the back side there. And the yellow is going to be my positive, so I'm going to plug that into the back side of the blue. So now I've got my scope leads hooked into the meter leads, and we're ready to go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go up here to the automotive drop down button, and we're going to drop that down. We're going to go to sensors, and we're going to go all the way down here at the bottom to TPS, and we're going to go to the throttle position potentiometer, or throttle potentiometer is what they're calling it. Click on that. It'll bring up the example page. That's what I should see. This is my instructions, so if I want to figure out how to hook it up, there we go. So I can minimize this one, and here's what I should see on the trace. So I'm going to go ahead and start the trace, and I'm going to operate the throttle position. Okay, all the way up, all the way down. Do it fast a couple of times. You can kind of write your name with it, whatever you want to do. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to pause this. I'm going to get a good trace and pause it. Okay, so that's the trace that we got. And if you notice, it's a nice clean line all the way up, nice clean line all the way down. We went up to about 4.5 volts. We started at 0.5 volt. So this is all good. So that's how you would check a throttle position sensor with an oscilloscope.